The dragon mother leaped, and while her body was surrounded by powerful energy, she prepared to attack the sword saint. The sword saint, who was standing in front of her, began to stare at her and mocked her by asking if she was worried, and she also decided to see how much dragon blood the dragon mother had. Just before the dragon mother could approach, she unsheathed her sword and used the ultimate sword technique called steel gale cuts, began to swing the sword precisely, and launched some powerful cuts towards her. The dragon mother put both arms in front of her face, clenched her teeth tightly, and managed to block the attack at the last second. The sword saint began to look at her with a calm gaze and thought that the dragon mother issue was almost resolved. She did not know if Loder had already taken care of the dragons and goblins. While she was deep in thought, a strong explosion occurred in the city, causing several knights to be blown into the air. The sword saint turned her head back, and upon seeing an explosion, she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and soon realized that the riot was not over yet. The dragon mother began to stand up, started staring at her, and couldn't help but start smiling when she saw that the goblins had arrived just in time. Now that the sword saint was distracted, the dragon mother took advantage of this and transformed into energy. She began to flee and said goodbye to her. While the body of the sword saint was surrounded by a powerful energy, she turned around and began to wonder what was happening. The dragon mother began to fly and asked her to wait for her to heal since she was not going to let her go so easily. The sword saint put her hand near her mouth, started looking at her, and upon seeing that she had escaped, realized that this was not good. She began to wipe her mouth with her hand, and with a piercing look asked the dragon mother to just wait, as she was going to go to Dragon Island and would eventually kill the entire dragon race. Several hours later, in the city it began to get dark. The sword saint arrived and she finished off many of the goblins that were lurking around. While with one hand she was holding the sword, she extended the other hand to one side, started walking, and with a serene look asked the knights where Loder was. She could not help but think that they were useless since they couldn't even kill some goblins. In front of her there was a wounded knight who was sitting on the ground, and next to him there was a woman who had torn clothes and was very scared. While he had one hand on the ground and the other over the wound, he revealed to her that Loder and Ifraya had been captured by goblins. The sword saint approached them, and upon hearing this, she clenched her teeth tightly and with a furious look began to wonder how this was possible. The city was filled with corpses of knights. The wounded knight revealed to her that these goblins were unusual, as their strength was comparable to that of a great species, adding that not even Loder had been able to defeat them. The sword saint began to look at the ground and did not say a single word. She turned her back on the knight, clenched her fist tightly, and with a determined look decided to go massacre all the goblin tribes of the haunted forests. The woman who was next to her began to look at her with a confused expression, and just before she could leave, she grabbed her arm with both hands, started crying, and with a sad look asked her to stay, since no one knew if the evil goblins were going to return to attack. The people who were in the city approached the area. Everyone began to prostrate themselves before the sword saint. They explained to her that they were people from the town and from the empire, and also asked her to stay with them. She began to look at the ground, and with a lost gaze thought that they were right, since compared to a captured member of the hero squad, protecting the people of the temple was her duty. If Loder was going to blame someone, then he could only blame himself for being too weak, who couldn't even kill some goblins. She decided to ask for help from the royal family. At the same time, in the tribe of the goblins and elves were doing their daily tasks. The little goblins started running and informed everyone that the boss had returned. Lintan and the others came back. They captured Ifraya and Loder and tied them by their hands. The goblins and elves from the tribe approached them, and seeing that he had captured 2 humans, they couldn't help but wonder where he had captured them from. The goblins threw Ifraya but first onto the ground. They sat her and Loder near a rock. The goblin, who wore a crest, turned his back on them, and as he was walking away gave the order to the others to behave. Loder, who had his hands tied, began to look at the goblin with a furious gaze and clenched his teeth tightly. The goblin approached an elf and began to scold her. Loder began to observe this and explained to Ifraya that even these goblins held many elves captive. Ifraya began to blush, and while she was panting heavily, she started looking at him and told him that there might be some kind of hero in this tribe. Loder approached her and with a worried look asked her if she had recovered a bit. She clasped her hands together, closed her eyes, and began to use her power, causing a golden energy to appear around her body. According to her, this poison was very strong. Her body still needed some time to recover. At that moment, Lintan, who had both hands in his trouser pockets, appeared and began to smile upon seeing that the poison had lost its effect so quickly. He couldn't help but praise Ifraya since her recovery ability was truly incredible. She opened her eyes and couldn't help but start trembling. Loder began to look at him with a gaze full of hatred. But at that moment, a goblin appeared, grabbed his arm with one hand and placed the other on top of his head. Lintan grabbed Ifraya by the leg. She panicked, began to move away, and asked him how he knew her name and what he was trying to do to her. Lintan started to smile even more and asked her if she really wanted to know what he wanted to do to her. He dug his sharp nails into her leg, causing her to open her mouth and start screaming in agony. While she was screaming, Lintan began to enjoy this moment. Beside them was Loader, who tried to do something about it, but the goblin grabbed him by the arms. Upon witnessing this, Loader could not help but start to get angry and with a furious look began to shout and gave Lintan the order to stop. The goblin gave him a hard slap in the face and ordered him not to shout at the boss. Due to the blow, he fell to the ground, supported himself with one hand and an elbow on the ground. While he was getting up, Lintan pulled out his sharp nails from her leg. Loader began to look at him with a disdainful glance and realized that he was a goblin with high intelligence. He asked him if he had not considered the consequences of capturing them, adding that the power of the Sword Saint could kill the entire tribe of goblins in one blow. Lintan began to smile and with a serene look revealed to him that the Sword Saint was also going to be his prey. But it was not yet time. He had already sent someone to hide their tracks. Even if she wanted to find them, she would not be able to find them here. He stood up, began to wipe his hand with a handkerchief, turned his head back and gave the order to the goblin to let some second-generation goblins now kill more monsters in the forest. While Ifraya was writhing in pain on the ground, the goblin approached them, placed his hand over his chest, bowed his head before Lintan and replied with the understood. On this occasion, the operation had become so big that humans were not going to be able to let it pass. He had to complete his evolution before they knocked on the door. Lintan put his foot on Loader's chest and told him that now he was going to ask and he must answer, and if he did not cooperate, he was not sure which part of his body would be missing. Loader clenched his teeth and thought this was not good. While Lintan had his foot on his chest, he supported one hand on his knee, unsheathed the dagger, and while his body was surrounded by a murderous energy, he asked him if humans liked to secretly imprison goblins and torture them. Loader panicked and with a look full of fear asked him what he was talking about and also added that he was talking pure shit. Seeing this, Lintan told him that he had been too slow to respond. Using the dagger, he made a powerful cut with which he cut off Loader's ear. He put his hand over his ear and began to writhe in pain. While Ifraya had both hands on the wound and her body was trembling, she began to look at him and could not help but panic. Lintan stood up, started touching his head with his hand, and fell silent. Loader's ear fell to the ground, and as he was covering the wound with his hand to stop the bleeding, he began to look at Lintan and explained that everything they were doing was to protect humanity, adding that it was their duty to exterminate monsters like him. Lintan began looking at Loader and asked him if they really did this for humanity, and out of obligation. He knew that they did this to constantly improve the status of their hero squad. Some time ago, Loader and Ifraya massacred an entire goblin village and people began to praise them. It was much easier to kill the humans who were in the way along with the monsters than to save them alive. He asked Loader how many victims of human blood they had on their hands, those who claimed to be just in fulfilling their duties. Loader and Ifraya panicked as they did not know how a goblin knew everything they were doing. Lintan brought his hand to his face, began to stare at them, and with a smile told them that the conversation was now over, adding that he was different from them, as he did not have to pretend to be fair because he was innately evil. He revealed to them that this monster would now teach them a lesson. Lintan began to have some fun with Ifraya, who closed her eyes and began to blush, asking Loader for help. Lintan began to give her so much pleasure that her eyes filled with tears. Witnessing this, Loader went crazy and ordered him to take his dirty hands off her. Just before he could do anything, two goblins started tying his arms. Ifraya opened her mouth and while she was enjoying it, Lintan decided to return the same words she had said to him. "This is just the beginning, you better hold on." Lintan put a hand on her shoulder, grabbed her by the neck with the other, began to look at Loader and told her that now her Loader was going to be able to enjoy the show. A bunch of goblins started approaching her. Lintan stood up, and with an evil smile decided to see what these goblins were going to do. Loader began to feel very afraid since he realized what was going to happen. While Ifraya was lying on the ground, the goblins began tearing off her clothes. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.